10 years ago, we sold about 4 million computers a year, and now we sell about 40 million computers a year, so it's about 10 times the volume. And there have been some pretty dramatic things that are changing in our industry. In the year 2000, there were about 100 million devices that were connected to the internet. And if you recall, at that time, everybody was talking about, okay, it's the age of the internet and the dot-coms, and this is all very exciting. Well, by our calculations, by 2010, there will be 14 billion devices attached to the internet. So it's actually still growing at a pretty enormous pace. If you sort of break that down and you say, well, what are those devices? Certainly you've got a lot of telephones. There are almost 4 billion telephones out there, many different shapes and sizes. About 1 billion PCs that are attached to the internet. And every day, about 500,000 new users come onto the internet for the very first time in their lives. So it's a pretty staggering rate of growth in terms of the number of new users. And of course, the vast majority of those new users are in emerging countries and emerging economies around the world. You don't have 500,000 new people in the United States getting on the internet or in Western Europe. So it's places like Africa, particularly Northern Africa and the Middle East, where there's enormous growth. Of course, Asia, China, India, all the former Soviet republics, Latin America, enormous growth in those countries, and kind of following the growth of telephony and telephone, which is tremendous. Now, along with that, there are also real changes in kind of what people are doing with the devices and the kind of connectivity that they have. So, when you first experienced computers, you had monochrome text, and then you had graphics, and then you had pictures, then you had movies and high definition, and so we're now experiencing a massive wave of high definition video coming to the internet, and it's on demand, and it's you're able to kind of pull it when you want it. Now, all these users and all these devices and all this expansion in the bandwidth and the amount of data that you can send mean that there's enormous growth in the infrastructure, and certainly business opportunities for companies like ours, but also big responsibilities that come with that, because these devices draw a lot of power, they consume a lot of energy, and we as providers have to really take special care into thinking about how do we drive the energy consumption of these devices down so that we make the economy much more efficient, even as we're producing more devices. So it's been a pretty exciting time for me. Our company is about 24 years old now, and I'm 43. I started the company when I was 19, and I was the CEO of the company for the first 20 years of its life, and then wasn't the CEO for about 2.5 years, and now I'm back in the CEO job for about 1.5 years. And it's also interesting to reflect on the last 10 years where our company had a very sort of monolithic strategy of growth, which you'd have to say if you grew the business by 10 times in units, that was a pretty good thing. But there were some changes that were going on in the industry with the enormous number of new consumers coming online, the growth in emerging countries, which caused us to kind of alter our strategy. And we've kind of set the company on a new course, and now growing again faster than the industry, kind of back to the historical growth pattern of the company where we like to be growing faster than our industry. So it's kind of an amazing industry if you think about it. If you say, well, what is this industry really all about? Well, it's kind of about every industry in the world. It's about medicine and science and education and business and entertainment and all forms of entertainment or productivity running across every element of society everywhere in the world. So it's a pretty broad kind of business, and so we get to see a lot of things. And I would say we try to be pretty good at understanding the technological inputs, and we try to be pretty good at understanding customer requirements. The thing that is most hard to predict are the compound inventions, and these are usually created by customers of ours, where they take 3 or 4 things that are commonly available, they'll put them together, and they'll create an entirely new business or entirely new way of doing things that nobody really ever anticipated, at least we didn't. And we see a lot of that going on. So for example, right now, we see in the Boston area a lot of genomic startups that are buying large numbers of servers. Usually when we sell a company a server, we think, well, okay, they're buying a server. Maybe they have 50 employees or 100 employees and they need a server. Well, these are companies that have like 10 and 15 employees, but they're buying hundreds of servers. Well, that doesn't really fit into the model that we had. Well, what are they doing? Well, they're processing enormous amounts of data, and they're using the amazing computing power to go solve big problems. A lot of the problems out there in science are fundamentally computational problems. And the great news is that the amount of computational power that is available and coming in our industry is just enormous. And it's not slowing down at all. So it's great industry, lots of fun.
I'm a big believer that businesses can be created today that are far more capital efficient than a decade or 3 decades ago. Technology is available now that allows businesses to scale at much more rapid rates. You look at the rates of growth for very successful new ventures, they're far greater than they were a few decades. To think about the point of impact. If you're running a business with 100 people, the point of impact for the leader is very different than if it's 1,000 people or 10,000 or 100,000. And so that's the frame of reference that I've always used, is to say, okay, if I'm leading this organization, what are the things that actually I can do to cause it to be successful? If it's 1,000 people, it's very, very different than it is for me today. So today I'm a lot more focused on strategy, because that's the point of impact on a 110,000 person company. On a 100 person company, you're sort of doing any job in the organization. You're doing every job in the organization, potentially, and that might be okay at that point. As a business grows, the natural tendency would be to take fewer risks and to be cautious and to have contingency plans. But in a business that's changing very quickly, or one that you want to grow, you actually need to be explicit about accepting risk. One of the people who work with me kind of described it this way. I was sort of encouraging this person, hey, let's try this, why don't we do this, how about this? And at some point he kind of came back and said, so what you're telling me is you want me to try to do 10 things, and if I only get 8 of them, you'll be okay with that. If I don't get all 10, versus having 5 things and doing all 5 perfectly. That's exactly right. We want to accept some experiments. Just like every other venture, they're not all going to work. But in the context of a large company, we can actually define some very healthy risk appetite that is very productive in terms of our future growth, what the culture is. In our situation where we were creating a new way of doing business, that was actually part of our culture as well. And as we wanted to attract people from, let's say, related spaces, we didn't actually want them to bring, the culture of the other companies. We might want some insights from their experience and that sort of thing. But we had to be very explicit about what the Dell culture was really all about, what the values are, particularly as we expand around the world. We say, no, these aren't necessarily American values. These are the Dell company values.